You're not much of a believer in the paranormal, are you?
Alan looked me directly in the eye as he spoke the words. He used his index finger to push his thick black-framed glasses back up the bridge of his nose and smiled beneath his bushy brown beard.
What makes you say that?
I took a defensive posture, a little put off by the presumptions of this man whom I'd met only minutes earlier. It's not that he was incorrect, but the way he framed his question like a statement showed an arrogance that got under my skin.
It's just a feeling I get. One of the side effects of being a sensitive. I tend to quickly empathize with the living and the dead.
He shifted his coffee cup in between his hands before lifting it to his lips for a drink.
So I take it you're here to debunk me.
That was the moment I realized that I didn't like Alan Heinz. Not that he was wrong, I didn't believe in the paranormal one bit, and I was there to try and prove him a fraud. Alan had made a bit of a name for himself in certain circles for a book he'd written called The Most Dangerous Haunted House in America. Some people called it one of the greatest works of paranormal nonfiction ever written. I personally saw it as an exploitation of tragedy and a load of bullshit. Prior to meeting the man, I hadn't liked his work or his ethics, but only minutes after feeling his weak handshake, I realized that I didn't much care for the man himself.
Good instincts,
I said with a shrug.
Frankly, Mr. Heinz, I think your book was disgusting. To pass fiction off as fact while people are still looking for answers in a real tragedy is abhorrent.
He sat across from me, still wearing that light-hearted smile. I thought my bluntness would get some kind of reaction out of him, rattle his cage a bit, but he was clearly practiced at being called a liar. As the waitress walked by, he touched her arm gently and asked for a refill on his coffee. His demeanor was so casual that it made me want to tense up just to counter it.
I've dealt with closed-minded types such as yourself my whole life. It's nothing new to me, Mr. Saxon.
The way my name rolled off his tongue was slimy and disingenuous. He readjusted his glasses and prepared the words in his mind, things he'd certainly said 1,000 times before, and to me obvious as practiced lies.
How do you explain all the events that led up to the murders of the McKellen family?
There's always a logical explanation. People like to jump straight to the paranormal for every bump in the night. Truth of the matter is that 75% of ghost cases have a simple, non-paranormal cause. The other 25%,
I leaned close to him over the table, are bold-faced fucking liars.
How do you explain the months of activity described by the McKellen family in my reports? The footsteps in the night, the moved objects, the threatening words carved into the wall, the family pet dying mysteriously, the sound of voices. All of it with absolutely no sign that any corporeal entity had been in their home.
He gestured wildly as he spoke as if he were conducting a symphony and trying to draw his audience toward his desired conclusion.
Just say person.
I scowled.
Excuse me?
He raised an eyebrow and I watched his mouth droop behind his beard.
Person. Just say person instead of corporeal entity.
I crossed my arms over my chest and gave him what must have been a look of impatience. He shifted in his seat like a nervous kid waiting to be chewed out by the school teacher.
Fine. However you want to phrase it. No one ever found any evidence that they had a physical intruder in the home.
So it's someone who's good at covering their tracks. Locks can be picked, gloves can be worn. That doesn't mean it's a ghost.
Firstly,
he raised his index finger.
You are correct about that. But how did your mystery intruder escape the house? The front door was locked and chained from inside. The back deadbolted, also from the inside. Hell, even all the windows were locked.
I prepared myself to respond when he held up a second finger and cut me off.
Secondly, it wasn't a ghost that did this.
I stared blankly at him, wondering if he just admitted to his lie.
It was a demon.
I rolled my eyes, recalling that tidbit from his book, and suddenly wondered how I could ever have thought such a bullshit artist would ever tell the truth. I'd met some people in my time who believed some crazy things, and they all had one thing that planted that seed of doubt in your subconscious. Conviction. Alan Heinz had exactly zero conviction in his voice when he said the word demon. It was like having a conversation with a made-up character who'd broken the fourth wall. It was like the Alan Heinz in his book was sitting right in front of me, the dedicated ghost hunter, and now that I saw it up close, it was even less convincing. Locks can be picked, gloves can be worn, and everything can be explained if you look hard enough. There was always an answer, and in my experience, demons are never it. He sat back in his seat, visibly frustrated with me. When I asked for this meeting, I wanted to see if you bought your own bullshit, and looking in your eyes, I don't think you do.
I have nothing to prove to you. I don't care what site you are writing an article for. You can call me a liar all you want, but the fact stands that I know the truth about what happened to those people. If you don't want to accept that, then go ahead and keep grasping for answers you won't find.
He signaled the waitress to bring him the check and turned back to me.
I feel sorry for skeptics such as yourself, Mr. Saxon. The world must look so small to you.
The waitress dropped the check on the table and Alan snatched it up quickly, in a rush to get out of my sight. Maybe he was rattled or frustrated, but it was clear that he wanted to walk away from me as soon as possible. "Take me to the house," I blurted out. "Prove it to me." He stopped, dead in his tracks, and turned to me with a puzzled look on his face. It was as if I'd asked him to take me to the moon. He smiled nervously and stood fidgeting with the check in his hand.
I don't know if that's such a...
"You still have access, don't you, for your independent research?" I cut him off and stood up to meet his gaze straight on. "If you can make a believer out of me, then I'll give you a favorable write-up. Otherwise, I'll just write the article I was always going to write in the first place. You have nothing to lose, everything to gain."
The spirit world isn't some dog and pony show that will perform on command for you, Mr. Saxon.
Excuses. What are you afraid of, Mr. Heinz? Now I was smiling, watching him timidly step back from me. He pouted and then slowly nodded in agreement.
Fine, I'll take you. Don't blame me for whatever happens there, though. There is something evil in that house.
Whatever you say. With that, we left the diner and I followed him to the home of the MacLeod family slaughter, both of us hoping for the same thing in our hearts, to expose a demon. Alan's hands were shaking as he put the key into the lock of the old house. He glanced back at me nervously as the deadbolt clicked and he pushed the door open. "Nervous?" I asked with a bit of humor in my voice.
This place has always made me feel unsettled. I'm sensitive to these kind of energies.
I could see a bead of sweat already forming at his thinning hairline. "Whatever you say, Chief." I walked past him into the house and could feel his eyes on me as he walked in behind. "So, where do we start? How do we find this big bad demon of yours?"
I told you back at the diner, it doesn't work like that.
His frustration with me was apparent as the worried look in his eyes. I'm not sure if he thought my article was going to damage his rep, or he just genuinely felt uncomfortable in the place where a family had been killed. I wondered how many times he'd even actually been here since the family died. "You were working with the MacLeods prior to their deaths, right?" I asked as I peeked into the dining room. The image of Mr. MacLeod's eviscerated corpse laid out on the dining room table ran through my head and sent a shiver down my spine.
I was. They had been hearing voices and footsteps in their house at night, yet couldn't find a cause. I was contacted to help them find answers.
Alan continued to stand in the entrance of the house like he was afraid to move. "And you told them it was a ghost. Sorry, demon." I walked past him towards the living room with little more than a sideways glance in his direction. The couch had been removed and sections of the carpet torn out where Mrs. MacLeod had bled out. Her throat had been cut. They say that she died the quickest out of everyone.
No, I didn't know what it was. I promised to help them find answers, and that's exactly what I did. I did a full investigation of the house, but the activity seemed to cease when I was on the premises.
"So how did you come to your conclusions?" I took a seat on the stairs, finally accepting Alan's reluctance to follow me.
I left tape recorders in the house overnight and heard the same voices and footsteps when the family said they were sleeping.
"So you never actually saw anything yourself? How do you know it wasn't them lying or playing a trick on you?"
The voice on the tape didn't sound anything like anyone in the family, and the things it said were terrifying. That's when I concluded that it was something inhuman.
I could see the look on his face grow even more uncomfortable by the moment. I was wondering if I'd misjudged his conviction and his beliefs. He seemed genuinely unnerved recalling the voice he'd heard. "Can I show you something?" I said, standing up and signaling him to follow me up the stairs. He didn't answer, but after a few moments began to walk up after me. I stopped in front of a hallway closet in between the master bedroom and the room where the kids had been found, stabbed to death in their beds. I opened the closet door and pulled the chain to click the light on. The back wall was covered in wood panel shelves. "What do you see?" I asked him. He looked at me confused for a second and then shrugged.
Just a closet. What are you getting at here?
Look closer. My tone fell flat, conveying the seriousness of what I was trying to do. He leaned forward and looked all around the closet, giving it a thorough visual examination. Do you see anything?
No, nothing.
He stood back up and looked at me with guarded eyes.
Is there some kind of point you're trying to prove here?
Only that people miss things. I leaned down below the bottom shelf where there was roughly 2 feet of clearance and pushed the wood panel in before sliding it off cleanly, exposing the crawl space beyond. Alan peered curiously into the newly uncovered space before giving me a side eye. I smiled at him as he stared, coming to some sense of realization.
How? How do you know that was there?
He stood up and started backing away from me. Exactly, Alan. How could I know? The cops didn't know. You didn't know. Even the McKellans didn't know. I stood up and took slow steps towards him. He backed away further out of instinct, despite still being utterly confused. So how could I, of all people, know? He looked like he was about to cry as he backed into the banister and steadied himself. He quickly looked back over his shoulder to the floor below, and then back to me. The answer is that I grew up in this house, and that was the spot where I used to go and hide from my father when he was feeling particularly mean and drunk. I watched his face momentarily attempt to relax till he realized I was still moving close to him and I had more to say. It's also where I hid 20 years later while I watched the McKellen family go about their daily business. I picked the locks one day and just made my way back to my spot. I listened. I watched them from inside the walls until I was ready to strike.
What are you saying?
Alan was now sliding along the banister towards the stairs. I'm saying I killed them, Alan. That's how I know you're a lying fraud. I smiled with satisfaction. Finally ending my ruse felt freeing. Originally, I wanted to find out if you knew anything that could link back to me. You don't. Now I'm going to kill you just because I think you're a fucking piece of shit. The slow, steady movements we'd both been making suddenly broke into a chase. Alan tried to make his way to the stairs, but I caught him with little effort and shoved him forward head first down the stairs. I watched as he tumbled end of end until he landed at the bottom. He lay there for a few moments staring up at me, terrified as I walked down slowly after him. Looks like you may have broken something there. I pointed to his leg that was twisted in a wrong position. I rushed forward and dropped down next to him, putting my hand over his mouth to stifle the coming screams. He clawed at me with his hands and tried to drag himself away from my grasp, but it was too late for him. I took the knife from my inside jacket pocket and watched his teary eyes grow wide. Meet the demon you've been looking for, Mr. Heinz. He tried to scream in protest as I sunk the blade between his ribs. He convulsed and shook in my grasp as I felt the blood pour out over my hand. I plunged the blade into him over and over again, right there on the floor of the house where I'd slaughtered that family before him. It brought back the most beautiful flashbacks, sending a chill of excitement up my spine as the life drained from his body. I left him on the same table where I'd left Mr. McKellen. They shared the same look on their face when they realized that the voices they'd been hearing, the footsteps, everything they thought was paranormal, was just me, hiding in the walls. A dumbfounded terror. They also shared the same blank stare in death, slack-jawed and soaked in their own blood, still waiting for answers as to why. Sometimes there is no why, though. And sometimes it pays to be a skeptic.